Thank you, Mike. As mentioned earlier, the Denmaur management felt it would be worthy to, as Mike's just mentioned, mark the revival of Revive with a serious seminar session, and we wanted to address questions of sustainability and a low-carbon future. Last weekend, whilst President Obama was over here talking Brexit, over in New York, there were 171 countries signing up to the decision taken back in Paris at the Paris Climate Change Agreement back in December. We wanted to ask the questions about the Climate Change Agreement. What will the impact be on business, industry, in fact, indeed all of us? What effect this will have on the demands placed on forestry and recycled fibre use. And whilst not suggesting we have any kind of silver bullet solution to climate change, we would like to explain how our revived carbon balance recycled papers might help customers and importantly their clients in turn to signpost their company's sustainable future. Now, appreciating that this is going to be fairly heavy stuff in some cases, and may create a tendency to head to the hills before the Thames flood, we thought it would be appropriate to provide suitable antidotes this evening with great British humour, great gaming entertainment, and of course traditional Denmaur good cheer and hospitality. So I'd just like to, we don't actually have our speakers lined up here, but I will introduce them before I ask them to come up onto the stage. So in the first instance, we've got leading environmentalist and former advisor to the government, Jonathon Porritt. We have environmental economist for PwC, Tom Mahill. Manager of Global Forest Trade Networks for WWF, Julia Young. Director of Carbon Co, Jonathan Tame. And Senior Conservationist at the World Land Trust, Roger Wilson. And Sustainability Manager at Denmaur Independent, Danny Dugan. So I'd like to ask Jonathan to come up. Basically, Jonathan, appreciating the climate change agreement took place over many days, we only have, say, 20, 25 minutes to appreciate what went on, and I wonder if you can come up here and enlighten us about that event and what was agreed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and very nice to be here this afternoon, and indeed this evening, I hope. It's actually always rather nice for me to be at an event where I know that the vast majority of the audience will be lovers of forests, because it does, after all, provide the raw material, and lovers of forest products. And this is actually my community, funnily enough. When I was 19 years old, I was living out in New Zealand. I was an obstreperous and difficult young man, and my mother suggested the best thing I could do would be to go and plant trees to get me out of the way. And it worked really well. And for the next 3 years, I planted a lot of trees. In fact, I planted 75 hectares of radiata pine in New Zealand back in the 1970s, which grew, as you know, it grows a lot faster in New Zealand than it does here in the UK and most other places. And I enjoyed the planting, I enjoyed the pruning, I enjoyed the thinning, I enjoyed the management, and I enjoyed the clear felling. Because if you want to be into forestry, you better get used to the fact that trees have to come down as well as trees go up. And I've never had any sentimentality about that whatsoever. So good forest management is in my environmental genes, as it were. It got me into this whole environment story. So it's fun to spend some time, again, with people who are very interested in that whole story. However, I'm not really asked to talk about forestry per se today. I've been asked to talk about Paris and this big climate agreement that you just heard mentioned, and what its significance is for all of us, all of your companies, and how quickly is the impact of Paris going to work its way through into your lives? Because you might be tempted to think, oh yeah, just another big international agreement. We see them come and go, and nothing much ever changes, so why should we be worried about this one? Okay. I'm here to tell you not why you should be worried, but why you should be intrigued as to what the implications of Paris really are. I had a meeting earlier today in an alternative London club called the House of St. Barnabas. And we were having our meeting in the Dickens room. And of course, being a curious and difficult type, I said, why is this called the Dickens room? And nobody knew. So they eventually went away and found somebody who did know. And it's called the Dickens room because it was in the Dickens room that Charles Dickens wrote some of his novels, including The Tale of Two Cities. And that made me think, Tale of Two Cities, you know that opening paragraph, you know the opening sentence to that, the best of times and the worst of times. Paris represented the best of times and the worst of times when it comes to understanding the dynamics of climate change. I am obviously not going to run you through the whole scientific story about climate change. You were right, I'm going to spare you that, which means I have to get to the point quite quickly. Climate change is very much for real. It is now predominantly man-made. It is impacting on the lives of hundreds of millions of people in an extremely damaging and painful way even now. And unless we begin to get our act together, it will continue to impact more and more ferociously on more and more people indefinitely into the future. That's basically what the science of the Paris Agreement is all about. And it all came down to a rather interesting discussion about what are these safe limits for us? What is the safe operating space for humankind? We know the temperature's rising, average temperature's rising. We can't stop that in the short term because we have a very carbon-intensive economy. We have an economy that depends on burning a lot of fossil fuels, and when you burn fossil fuels, you release these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We can't stop that overnight, obviously. So what is the safe operating space for humankind? And in Paris, the scientists basically said to the politicians, the safe operating space for humankind is a lot smaller than you thought it was. We used to think that we could have an average of a 2 degrees centigrade increase in temperatures by the end of the century. Scientists are now telling the politicians, no, that is not safe. That does not guarantee a stable climate for the future of humankind. And we now have to aim at 1.5 degrees centigrade, not 2 degrees centigrade. It may not sound like much. You're probably used to turning down the thermostat or turning up the thermostat. 0.5 of a degree doesn't sound like a huge amount. In climate terms, with the whole global ecosystem in your mind, this is a massive difference. Massive difference. And essentially what we now know is that what is called the window of opportunity to get this stuff right has become rather smaller than it was before. And by getting it right, I mean only one thing. I mean slowing down the impact of climate change so as to avoid what the scientists call runaway, irreversible climate change. And if we get to that point, relax, because there won't be anything you can do about it. It'll just be untold misery for the whole of humankind from that point on. That's the end of the worst of times, okay? I've done the worst of times. The whole of the rest of my talk is going to be about the best of times. But I do want to land this one with you first, because I know in a representative group of business people such as yourselves, there will be a few, inevitably, who are still a tiny bit skeptical about this notion of climate change impacting their business or their lives or even their children's lives, who may well subscribe to a sort of dissenting view about climate change, may well be tempted to listen to alternative voices, may think, for instance, that the likes of Jeremy Clarkson, to name but one, Nigel Farage, to name but another, and a whole host of notorious characters represent the high point of authority on the science of climate change. I do hope you don't sustain that illusion for very long. It could cost you and your companies very dear. These are not climate scientists. These are politically charged ideologues who are intent on keeping you from the level of knowledge that you need to represent your companies and the interests of your companies properly. So put them to one side, okay. I may come back and talk about electric cars, in which case I could get back to Jeremy Clarkson, because even he's quite excited about the Tesla, I'm told. This is the only thing that really gets him going in the world of alternative technology. Okay, so that was the worst of times in Paris, and it was really gritty for the politicians to have to understand how quickly this unfolding story about climate change is now going to materialize in our lives and pretty much change everything that we do. So how do you get from there to the best of times? How do you move from this really quite depressing story about could be happening not so far in the future if we don't get things sorted to what could be happening in the very near future if we do start to get things sorted? And the brilliant stuff going on in Paris was that there were so many people there representing solutions to the problems, representing a whole new way of thinking about low-carbon prosperity. Opportunities to create wealth in a completely different way, using the power of innovation to create these low-carbon, ultra-low-carbon solutions to the problems that we face. This pattern of innovation is breaking out all over. Last year, something like $329 billion were invested in clean energy, in ways of generating the energy we need without causing the emission of these greenhouse gases that cause the warming in the atmosphere. 327 billion. We actually need to get to $1 trillion a year to do this decarbonization story fast enough. $1 trillion, so 3 times what we're currently doing. And we need to get from 330 billion to $1 trillion of new investment in clean energy within the next 5 years. Now, all good capitalists will understand that in any period of human history, recent human history, since capitalism became very important to us, you see great swathes of change come bearing down on us at one point or another. We've seen it many times, which is why a lot of people now are talking about the new industrial revolution being a revolution to do with moving from fossil fuels towards low-carbon energy systems. This is the most exciting place to be. There are now thousands, tens of thousands of entrepreneurs who are out there fashioning low-carbon solutions in the world of energy, essentially in renewables, storage, new grid systems, efficiency, the whole bit about how you make an ultra-efficient, low-carbon energy economy. It's a bit geeky for some people, but it is really exciting. Yesterday, Forum for the Future, my organization, we launched a tiny little project called The Living Grid, in which we combined forces with 3 large companies here in the UK, with Aggregate Industries, Sainsbury's, and United Utilities, to introduce one of the smartest bits of software we have come across in a long time. And this is basically a bit of software that enables these companies to work with the national grid, to give the national grid just a little bit of electricity when it needs it, so when supply is being stretched and they need to find some extra energy to keep things stable, and then to take a little bit of energy back from the national grid when they need it themselves as companies. So it's called demand management response. It simply means that you are handling the total amount of electricity in that system with those 3 companies to optimize for the grid, optimize for the companies themselves, and optimize for lower carbon solutions. It is brilliant software. But it is just one tiny, tiny part of this whole notion of demand management, which is one tiny part of the energy efficiency story, which is one tiny part of the whole sustainable energy system. You have to see it in terms of these systems, incredible new ideas, incredible innovations, each one of which adds a little bit to the opportunity to create the energy system that we need to power the global economy from here on. And it will. We will get beyond fossil fuels much faster than you might think. It was a bit surreal for me to hear the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia saying the future of his country depended on understanding that fossil fuels, or the extraction and sale of fossil fuels, would come to an end sometime soon. Sometime soon. This is Saudi Arabia we're talking about. So the world is on the move. And you need to be alert to that, because it's happening far faster than you might see and you might realize. And that, I can assure you, is just one bit of the innovation pipeline. I've only talked about energy and one tiny bit of that. You can look at any other area of human endeavor, whether you're talking about water, manufacturing, land use issues, health, whatever else it is. This innovation for sustainability is an exploding story. It's why people now feel so excited. It's why people think it's not phony to talk about the best of times, to talk about opportunities coming out of this new awareness about the dangerous situation that we're in. Okay, so that's all the techie stuff, all right? That's all the things that will happen with innovators and engineers and bright people and investors trying to make money in the way that they always do, trying to find a bigger market share, trying to get others out of the way, classic stuff. But it isn't just about the technology. It isn't just about brilliant design and engineering. It is also about land. And this is really what we're going to be talking about more today. Not so much the technology end of it, but the land use side of it. Because you can't come up with a really good strategy for reducing the emissions of these greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, and so on. You can't do that unless you talk about land and the uses that we ask of that land. That's where, of course, forestry comes into it big time. And if you're thinking about land use strategies from the perspective of managing greenhouse gases, managing CO2, managing carbon dioxide, this is an incredibly simple story for the world to get its head around. There are only three things we have to do. Firstly, we have to stop cutting trees down. Natural forests, not commercial forests. We need to go on cutting them down, don't worry. I know where I'm speaking today. It's okay. We have to go on cutting them down because without that we wouldn't have a good paper, pulp, fiber industry. But in terms of our natural forests, we have to stop the destruction that continues today. And it still goes on. You may think it's a problem that was sorted long ago. It isn't sorted. In Brazil, in Indonesia, in Africa in particular, we are still seeing patterns of deforestation that are literally insane. They are crazy. So that's rule number one. Secondly, we have to massively raise tree cover generally around the world. One of the best ways of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, as I'm sure you all know, is through biomass. And as you plant trees, they soak up the CO2, and to a certain extent you can build in a balancing system at that point, a carbon-balanced ecosystem, if you like. And we have to get used to the fact that we're going to need to be planting hundreds of millions of trees and regenerating some of the world's forests as a big priority. Now, thirdly, this one isn't quite as easy, but we have to get there too. We have to farm in such a way that we don't allow so much of the CO2 to be released from the soil. In the soil, there are a huge amount of nutrients, organic matter that allows us to draw on that fertility to produce the crops that we need. And included in all of that organic matter is a large amount of CO2. Now, if you farm in an irresponsible way, a lot of that CO2 straight up into the atmosphere. And that is what is happening today. So we have to redesign pretty much our entire agricultural system to farm for carbon by keeping the CO2 in the soil so that it isn't released into the atmosphere. So stop deforestation, plant more trees, farm sensibly. That's the deal. That's the land use deal. And happily, at the end of the Paris conference, at the end of the discussion about all these things, it started to dawn on the politicians, particularly the French politicians who were there, that we needed to get going seriously on this business of land-based solutions to climate problems. So you can anticipate that from now on, the discussion about climate change won't just be about energy generators, won't just be about manufacturing and industry. It will increasingly be about land use. And that, for me, is what's really interesting here today, because in these troubled times, and they will be troubled, come what may, any company that has its eye on the ball, any company that understands the dynamic around climate change will be thinking first and foremost about how to thrive in that disruptive world. and how to come up with solutions for clients, for business partners, for investors that enable them to do what they need to do in a more efficient, carbon efficient, as well as resource efficient way. So when I heard about the revival of Revive, a brand with which I have been familiar over many years, I used to be director of Friends of the Earth in the 1980s, when Friends of the Earth was probably banging on the doors of quite a lot of people here today saying, we've all got to be doing more recycling. And you were probably saying, yes, I know, we need to get in there. And thank God for that. But when I heard about this, it struck me as really important. And the extra bit that you're doing now, that Denmaur is doing now, with the notion of carbon balance papers is, I think, really intriguing. I'm not going to speak to that because you'll hear more about that from my colleagues in a moment, and it is a really important part of the deal. Just remember, it's about this carbon story. It's about ensuring that the paper, the recycled papers that are sold, are also doing the right thing from a carbon balance perspective. It is, in effect, a sophisticated offset scheme. Now, there are quite a lot of people who don't like the word offset. I don't know what they're going to do in the future, because we're going to be doing offsetting all over the place. Just think for a moment about a different sector. Think about aviation. Aviation continues to grow by about 6% per annum. Almost everybody loves flying. A lot of greenies love flying, I have to tell you. So nobody really wants to see the aviation sector closed down. Very difficult to come up with technological solutions, alternatives to jet fuel, to A1 jet fuel. Very difficult. We'll get a little bit from bio-based fuels, and we'll get quite a lot from efficiency. But ultimately, we're going to go on using kerosene, jet fuel, for quite a long time to come. All the airlines have signed up to something called carbon neutral growth after 2020. Carbon neutral growth, which means that all the emissions from the increased seats that they're selling after 2020, the increased number of seats they're selling, all those emissions will have to be offset. We are talking about billions and billions of dollars on the offset market kicking in from 2020 onwards. So what you'll hear about in a moment, which is about land-based offset schemes to protect forestry, this is a small thing today, relatively small. It is going to become an absolutely huge thing. And we need as much innovation in that space, as much good governance, accountability as we do in any other area. So this is right slap in the middle of what good carbon management looks like for all companies today. And when you can sell carbon balance papers to companies and say, it's a small part of your total carbon footprint, but that's the bit that we can help with, that's our contribution to your total carbon management, that has to be a good thing. So you can see why the best of times is not just a rhetorical flourish. We're going to see a world that is going to be disrupted come what may. Come what may. It doesn't matter what I say to you today. The science of climate change tells us now that we're going to be living in a disrupted world. And it'll be disrupted for one of two reasons. It'll be disrupted because we don't do anything about climate change. We allow these dissenting, skeptical voices to let us drift on into this runaway phenomenon, in which case our lives are going to be very, very painfully disrupted, and it won't be fun. Alternatively, we do something about it. We do deploy this extraordinary organism between our ears, the human genius that resides here, to come up with the solutions that are available already today and new solutions for tomorrow, which will allow us to create wealth for 7 billion people today, 9 billion people by 2050, without crashing the climate system on which we depend. That's the innovation challenge. Now again, for good capitalists, you should not be frightened about this. One of the great heroes in the history of capitalism is a man called Joseph Schumpeter. Schumpeter wrote an extraordinary book extolling the benefits of capitalism, largely on the speed with which capitalism kills the things that no longer serve the wealth creation system well, and brings forward new things that create new value for people in that different economy. Call it creative destruction. And what you are going to be living through, for as long as you live, actually, whether it's a decade or several decades, what you will be witnessing is a phenomenal process of creative destruction as we move from one energy base to the economy, one route to land management, to another energy base and a different way of managing the land. There's something of an irony there. Creative economic destruction to protect the planet. You've kind of got to celebrate that, really. And you better, because it is our best chance of ensuring that the best of times wins out over the worst of times. Thank you.